After the attack at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was thrust into World War II, and everyday life across the country was dramatically changed. Food, gas, and clothing were rationed. Communities conducted scrap metal drives. To help build the weapons necessary to win the war, women found employment as electricians, welders, and riveters in defense plants. Japanese Americans had their rights as citizens stripped from them. People in the U.S. grew increasingly dependent on radio reports for news of the fighting overseas. And while popular entertainment served to demonize the nation's enemies, it was also viewed as an escape that allowed Americans a break from the war. Just as it did in World War I, the Office of War Information had the job of supporting the war effort through propaganda. They created pro-Allied and anti-Axis movies, posters, and radio ads and programs. One of the most famous propaganda posters of World War II was Rosie the Riveter, a fictional female character that supported the war effort by working in war factories. Posters like these pushed Americans to enlist, work in war factories, or keep quiet about where their loved ones were stationed. Once again, the government took control of the economy to create weapons for war. The War Productions Board was brought back to convert companies from peacetime to wartime production. It also allocated raw materials to key industries. By February 1942, the last automobile was produced for private use. Automobile factories produced planes and tanks. By 1943, shipyards were producing 140 Liberty ships per month. By 1944, nearly 18 million people were working 24/7, 3 times as many as in 1941. 6 million women worked in war factories while being paid 60% of what men were paid. Over 2 million minorities also contributed to the war effort. To prevent the high inflation that happened during World War I, the government set up the OPA. It froze prices on most goods. Congress also raised taxes. WPB decided which companies would make war materials and how they were distributed. The Office of Price Administration set up a system of rationing. They issued coupons to buy scarce items. Households would receive ration books with coupons to be used for buying such scarce goods as meat, shoes, sugar, coffee, and gasoline. This was a way that everyone could contribute to the war effort. Between 1941 and 1945, 6.3 million Americans volunteered for military service, 38.8% of all American soldiers that fought in World War II. Volunteerism became a rallying cry during World War II on the home front. Young people joined several organizations, such as the Red Cross and the Victory Corps. Baseball players left the major leagues to fight in Europe and the Pacific. Everyone pitched in by donating items like scrap metal and rubber. The U.S. spent more than $300 billion fighting the Axis, which would be the equivalent of $4 trillion today. To help fund this, the government turned to ordinary Americans. The U.S. Treasury offered Americans a series of war bonds they could purchase during the war. You could buy a $25 war bond for $18.75. 10 years later, you could redeem it for $25. Many Americans bought multiple war bonds. Americans also planted victory gardens to prevent a food shortage. It ensured that the soldiers had enough food to fight overseas. It also helped Americans stretch out their ration coupons. By 1944, victory gardens produced 40% of all vegetables grown in the U.S. Americans grew tomatoes, carrots, lettuce, beets, and peas. Over 20 million victory gardens were planted across the U.S. World War II had a tremendous effect on the economy of the United States. Rationing prevented shortages in basic goods throughout the war. War bonds allowed Americans to earn some interest on their money while helping the soldiers. Victory gardens also prevented food shortages. The War Production Board, a government agency, coordinated war production with private companies to increase efficiency in manufacturing. Overall, the most significant effect was that it ended the Great Depression in the U.S., dropping the unemployment rate to just over 1%. After the attack at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, fear and suspicion of the large Japanese-American community on the West Coast grew. Fearing that these immigrants and first-generation Americans may aid the Japanese, the U.S. government forced over 110,000 Japanese Americans living along the West Coast into internment camps for the rest of the war. Executive Order 9066 declared California, Oregon, Washington, and southern Arizona a restricted military area. Fred Korematsu argued that his rights had been violated. In Korematsu versus U.S., the Supreme Court ruled that the military needs overruled civilian rights. It was repealed on January 2, 1945, and the Japanese and Japanese Americans returned to their homes. In 1988, the government apologized and paid $20,000 to each surviving internee. When the German scientists split uranium atoms for the first time in 1939, it released an enormous amount of energy. German refugee Albert Einstein warned FDR that German scientists could use this discovery to construct a weapon of enormous destructive power. In 1942, the U.S. government set out to build an atomic bomb as quickly as possible. Research for the creation of the bomb was done all over the nation. The Manhattan Project, named after Manhattan Island, was able to create 3 atomic bombs. The testing of the bomb occurred in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The 2 remaining bombs used in the war were Little Boy and Fat Man. Both bombs were over 10 feet long and weighed over 9,000 pounds. Little Boy was detonated in the sky over Hiroshima, and Fat Man over Nagasaki. A remote detonator set off a chain reaction that resulted in nuclear fission, the splitting of a nucleus of an atom. The resulting release of energy created the blast, each killing around 200,000 people. The following were the main scientists involved in the project: Niels Bohr, Joseph Carter, Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, and Robert Oppenheimer. The 22nd Amendment was a reaction to Franklin Roosevelt's election to a 3rd and 4th term as president. Every president before FDR had followed George Washington's 2-term precedent, set when he stepped down in 1796. There have been a few to attempt to secure a 3rd term, but none have been successful. When the Republicans took control of both houses of Congress in 1946, they pushed for a constitutional amendment to create term limits for the president. Passed in 1947 and ratified in 1951, the 22nd Amendment limits a president to 2 terms in office. It did not apply to sitting President Harry Truman, who took over when FDR died in 1945.